This morning, we have a presentation on the work that is done by deaf doulas, and Ginny Lapham is going to do the introduction of our speaker today. Ginny?
Thank you. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Amy Stapleton, who needs no introduction to most of you here at Dumbarton, who have seen her around the last couple of decades. But let me proceed. After earning a Master of Theology degree at Iliff University, Amy was ordained in the United Methodist Church, and she came to DC to work as field organizer for the Methodist Federation for Social Action. She started a few months before. I think some people haven't muted their mics, maybe.
Please.
Okay. Anyway, after arriving in DC, Amy was initially commuting from Virginia Beach, and then I was able to, when I started volunteering, to share an office with Amy and have been an admirer of her ever since. That Amy has used her seminary degree and to work in the local church as a hospital chaplain, as I said, as the field organizer at MFSA, and then as a team leader at the General Commission on Religion and Race. And this was before she went back and got another master's degree from Loyola University. And she is currently manager of bereavement services at Chesapeake Life Center, a counseling center associated with the Hospice of the Chesapeake, which offers professional counseling to those experiencing grief and traumatic loss. 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, Amy followed a new calling, bringing together all the parts of her life to become an end-of-life doula. This emerging field and practice is one that Amy describes as a way of being more than doing, a presence and accompaniment through life and death. It's now my great privilege to turn it over to Amy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this time and invitation. And I really regret that we're not together in person to just share this intimate conversation. I recognize that anytime we talk matters of the heart, that I find always better to be in person. And yet recognizing the strength of this community, I trust that we'll get there even through our variety of technology and Zoom and in person and all the ways that we can be a circle of listening and support for one another today. So I'm going to kind of, first of all, talk a little bit about what does it mean to be an end-of-life doula and some aspects of that. And then knowing you and counting on you, I'm hoping at the end we can have more conversation and just address any questions that might come up throughout. So with that, I'll start sharing my screen. So really today, I hope again is a conversation about not just dying, but living in transitions. And for me, one of the most powerful images I have is that throughout our life, we all need a team. And that team looks different at different phases of our life. But having a group of people, whether that's a church community, family, close friends, paid professionals, we all need a team. And one of the pieces of becoming an end-of-life doula for me was figuring out really how to offer to be a part of someone's team as they go through the transitions of life and death. So we're going to talk first today about what is an end-of-life doula, and why might you consider having one even if you're not actively dying, and how an end-of-life doula can support you and or your family in the process of living and dying well. So when you think about, let me see if I can see you all. How many of you have heard of an end-of-life doula or death doula or any sort of version of that? If you would just raise your hand so I can see you. Couple. Okay. All right. So sometimes end-of-life doulas have different names. They may call themselves end-of-life doulas or death doulas or a death advocate or an end-of-life planner or transition coach or death workers. There's lots of different terms out there for people who are doing this work. I think what's most important to recognize here is that not everyone brings the same skill set to this work or comes at it from the same place. And while a name is important, it's not necessarily inclusive of all that that person can bring to a process at an end of life. Now, just to be clear, the people that I have trained with, some of them are clinicians and nurses, some of them are massage therapists, and some of them are lawyers. So there's no one type of person that is attracted to this work or does this work. We all come to it from a different path. And I think it's really important if you're considering working with an end-of-life doula to be really clear on some of the things that you are looking for and find your people. It's like any other process, and that you want to interview, you want to check out, you want to get to know who you feel comfortable with, what are the skill sets they have and bring to the conversation, and ultimately how they can support you and be a resource. My specific training, as Jenny mentioned, started about 2 years ago. And early on, I went straight from college to seminary and started as a hospital chaplain in a level 1 trauma center. And people only saw the chaplains at the worst times of their life. And a lot of times, the calls I would get at 2 a.m. were either people who had been in an accident and were actively dying, or they were from the nurses who asked me to come in and simply be with someone as they died, which was something they themselves didn't have the time to do most often. I really, from that experience, felt deeply, and still do, that everyone deserves a witness, that the process of dying is one of the most sacred and can be beautiful pieces of our lives. We all are born dying, and to be able to be a witness to someone as they transition has been one of my greatest privileges. Ultimately, I got tired of seeing people dying, so I moved to being a grief therapist, where I got to support people living. Most often, I work with the family members of people who have gone through tremendous loss, sometimes very traumatic losses. And so I got to see the resiliency that carries and builds through us all when we face and do hard things. I love the work I do. So I've had the bookends, if you will, of this experience. But really becoming a death doula has brought together all the aspects of my life, personally and professionally. I bring to that work who I am as a chaplain, who I am as an ordained minister, who I am as a daughter who has now had both of my parents die, who I am as a professional counselor. So this work truly is a confluence of all that I hold dear, and I really seek to bring that to the clients that I work with. My particular training has occurred through the International End-of-Life Doula Association. They're one of the oldest associations of doulas that started in New York City and really was aligned with the hospice movement there. After that training, I completed another 100 hours with Going with Grace, which is a program on the West Coast with a Lua author. And part of why I did an additional program is I wanted a more holistic and balanced approach to this work. They were very different experiences for me. The first experience was very clinically driven. It actually is a CEU experience for nurses who are gaining more preparation to support people at the end of life. So there was a lot of technicality to it. The second program was really a little more well-rounded. Alua happens to be a lawyer herself, so she really focused on supporting people holistically through this process. And sometimes that can mean going through articles of closest to you know, items that you would like to give away, creating legacy projects, thinking about writing your obituary, thinking about medical directives and living wills and 5 wishes and all those things. So I feel like I got a really good variety in the programs that I attended and learned from. And then most recently completed a National End-of-Life Doula Alliance competency course, where I became in death doula work. There is no certification. It's different than social work or professional counseling in that way. There's not a one universally recognized certification to become a death doula, but the National End-of-Life Doula Association provides a core competency exam by which, once you complete, you're considered competent in these ways. So what do doulas actually do? I think the heart of being a doula is to provide a compassionate, non-judgmental presence, support people emotionally and spiritually as, you know, they find themselves faced with end-of-life conversations. That doesn't necessarily mean you start the work when someone is actively dying, but instead, I really think the work can begin as people transition throughout their life. Sometimes that comes about through an advanced illness, but a lot of times it just comes about from a life change. And having someone to bear witness, having someone to sit with who isn't so intimately connected to you, your family, in it in the same ways, I think is a really helpful perspective to have. My approach, and I would say the approach of most death doulas, is very family-centered. So we really take the client's lead. And sometimes we define family in the broadest sense of the word, right? So that can mean starting with the client and then determining what circles of support they want to include in this conversation. And sometimes it means helping them identify sources of support or having these conversations with family members that perhaps currently they're not even talking to. Death doulas can provide a lot of information, community resources, referrals, and can be a point of contact with the medical team. I want to be really clear, though, that death doulas are not medical professionals. They're not there to serve as a CNA or a nurse, but are really holistic in approach. And one of the core values I hold as a death doula is self-determination. I believe for as much as we can, we all should have options as to what a good death looks like for us. Not everything can we predict, not everything can we control, but I think ultimately we have a lot more choices and options than we think we do. And so being able to sit with people, sort out what those are, what their truest wishes are, and what their deepest fears are is also part of what I do as a death doula. Ultimately, it's about companionship and presence. Sometimes there's some logistical support. I know death doulas who have cleaned out garages and basements, who run errands and get groceries. You know, every death doula is different in the services they provide, but personally, all death doulas, I feel, should be advocates for their clients and ensuring that our clients' wishes are honored and respected throughout life and death. So for me, if I had to pick an image, this is one of my favorite images on the slide. It's actually from a day when I walked the Camino several years ago. And I was in Spain, and you can't really see it well in the picture, but it was super cold and windy that day. And it was about to start raining, and I had this huge pack, and I had a poncho over the pack. And I saw this woman who was struggling, and she had her arm in a cast. She was walking with a cane, a walking stick on the other side. Someone had taken her pack up ahead, and she asked me to help her put on her poncho. And so we kind of fumbled and got it on, and we walked on, mostly in silence, far enough to be able to see one another, but not necessarily together. And this particular woman happened to remind me of my grandmother's best friend, Naomi. And I think about that as kind of my image for death doula work, that it's really a practice of accompaniment. At the heart of that is recognizing that death is a process that we all must walk alone. And yet I feel like we do not have to be by ourselves. So for me, the practice of being a death doula is one of accompaniment. It's person-centered, it's bearing witness, it's honoring transitions in the life of another, and how people want to be cared for, treated, and remembered. The other part of being a death doula that is just core to what I believe is, again, that we have the opportunity to die well. That doesn't necessarily mean that we die without pain. That doesn't necessarily mean that we can control every aspect of dying. But I do think having conversations and intentions around a good death is a place to start. Recently, I found an article, and it talked about just the cost of medical care at the end of life and how it really limits the options of people. So as someone who works with a hospice and has done a lot of work in the hospital at end of life, I know that when you're in a medical facility, like a hospital at the end of your life, you tend to have less options around dying well. Most often because that particular context is about saving life, not necessarily honoring death. And so what I work with clients to really think about and consider are things like aging in place. What would it mean to die at home? What would you need in order to do that? What would it mean to die in a facility? How can we create the space that you want around you that really honors who you are, that's soothing? And that happens from considering what smells you want in your room. Perhaps you're a big fan of lavender, or perhaps you hate it. Knowing those things, like who are the people that you want around you? Would you want music or would you want quiet? Listening to the fears and the hopes of perhaps pain management or things that are unresolved. This is all what I think it means to die well. So a death doula, in my work, in my perspective, at the heart, helps people die well. The next aspect, I think, of a death doula really starts before death. And that has to do with more of an integrated life. I love Wayne Mueller. He wrote a book on Sabbath. He's written several books, but I like the idea and the question he asked: how shall we live? We know that we're all in the process of dying. We start that way when we enter this world. But how do we live with the end in mind? Kind of what's unresolved for us? What's missing? What are the conversations that we wish we would have had? And often, you know, I've found that people, we can't necessarily expect or plan on those conversations being complete when we die. But what we can do is have conversations with ourselves and even write letters to our loved ones. Or once I wrote a thank you note for someone who really wanted to make sure this person knew how much she had meant to them. So really thinking with clients on what's unresolved, what can be addressed in the now, and what's kind of the unfinished business that they're holding is part of my work as a death doula. Recently, I had a client who was wanting to have a conversation with other family members about bringing her mother home to die. The family had a lot of discord. There was not an agreement on, was this the time? Was this the way? And so what I was able to help that family do is just simply to facilitate a conversation around listening. And the goal wasn't agreement in that case. The goal was simply being able to express their grief and have their hurts heard and acknowledged, and their fears and their hopes for their mother in that time in her life. So part of what I bring to the work and what I hope a death doula would offer is these sorts of facilitated conversations. And perhaps they happen one-on-one with just the client, or perhaps more people are involved. So life and death are really one, even as the river and the sea are one. I love this quote, and I love this picture. This is from the Rachel Carson Wilderness area that I had the opportunity to spend time at this summer. And you can't see it here, but there's a part when you're walking through the sanctuary where the river is running both ways. And I spent a lot of time looking at that, trying to figure out how that happens, how the flow and the current and the tides change and come together in that particular place. But I feel like that's where we live. We live in the coming and our going, and throughout our life are holding both of those. And really, as a death doula, I find that's the sweet spot for this work. That's the honor of coming into someone's life and helping them imagine what their death can be. Some of my work with clients has included early on conversations. These people are not actively dying. They just want to talk about what they want and how they imagine their death to be. Others I have accompanied from the very beginning of a diagnosis and sat with them and watched them sometimes really progress through their illness very, very suddenly and rapidly. One particular story stands out to me, which has to do with touch. And this is, again, a part of the conversation with people around what they want as they're transitioning, as they're dying. I worked with this family. They happened to be two retired high school teachers. One taught earth science and the other taught English. And the husband was dying and wanted to die at home. And it was very important to him to kind of be in the center of the home. So they were able to move his hospital bed to the area just off the kitchen. He was kind of at the heart of all activity. And one day I went to visit, and we were talking about all the steady flow of people that were coming to see him. And he loved that. He loved being surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He also referenced and mentioned to me that he was just really tired of having his feet touched. It so happened that most of his life he had had ingrown toenails, and his feet were just kind of tender. And so now that his feet were in socks under a blanket at the very end of the bed, he said, "I don't know why, Amy, but that's the first thing people do. They come in and they grab my feet, they touch my feet, they squeeze my feet. It's kind of like instead of a handshake, I get a foot shake." And I said, "Well, how does that feel? And he said, I don't like it. It hurts. And I said, well, let's tell people that. And it led to a beautiful conversation about how he wanted to be touched, what felt good to him. And part of that was educating his family on how they could touch him, how they could kind of overcome some fear of hurting him or not being sure where to touch him, but actually do things to help him feel good, to rub his back, to touch his cheeks. So, those are the little things that have emerged in this work that for me have been so holy. And so I guess I just want to open it now to questions, and I have a lot more information, research. I could go a lot of different directions with this, but want to hear from you what your thoughts are, questions, and just have this be a conversation at this point.
So Amy, I think I'm going to start, if that's okay, Shirley.